All right, let's go ahead and get going. So thank you again, everyone, for joining the Education Writers Association for this webinar, Behind Remotely Closed Doors, Keeping Tabs on School Boards and Leaders. I'm Stacia Cedillo, a program specialist at EWA. And before we begin, let me go over some housekeeping items. If you have a question for our speakers, type them into the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. Please include your name and affiliation whenever you ask your question. And please ask your question at any time. And we'll be getting to those throughout the webinar, but also we'll have a dedicated time at the end to answer your audience questions. So send them in anytime with your name and affiliation. As soon as the webinar closes, you're going to get an evaluation survey. Please complete the survey. Your feedback is really important to us and helps us improve for our future webinars. So today we are joined by Gunita Singh, who is a legal fellow at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, Patrick Wall, who is a senior reporter at Chalkbeat Newark, and Eric Gorski, who is a managing editor for Chalkbeat. So thank you all for joining us today. I know things are very, very busy out there for reporters, but also for lawyers, so we really appreciate your time. Gunita, let's start with you. So can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press and how your work has ramped up since the coronavirus outbreak?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And thanks so much for including me in this webinar. I really appreciate it. This is an issue I feel really passionately about. So hopefully folks who are tuning in will be able to leave with a few more tools in their toolbox as they fight for access right now. So I'm a legal fellow at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, where I focus primarily on access to public records at the federal and state level, where I help litigate Freedom of Information Act cases, write amicus briefs, also known as friend of the court briefs, in public records cases in states across the country. And I also help individual journalists with their public records requests. So when the pandemic hit, we immediately began tracking how entities both at the federal and state level have been modifying their public records and open meetings obligations in light of public employees working remotely and, open meetings going virtual. And the data that we've collected is substantial. So we've made all of that publicly available on our website. So you're going to be able to toggle through that data and explore all the examples of where we've found modifications to open government laws. And I'd be happy to show the tracker on my screen so folks can get a glimpse of that. So here I am on the Reporters Committee homepage. And if you click Legal Resources, the first new item that we've added is Press Freedom and Transparency during COVID-19. There is a section dedicated to open meetings and public records, where you'll be able to get an overview of some of the modifications we're seeing, and you'll see some best practices that we are proposing. And the section ends with this link here to the tracker. And while it loads, I'll just mention that we are updating this multiple times a day as we continue to get information directly from reporters, and after looking on various, state secretary of state websites, state attorney general websites, state governor websites. So the first page you'll see is dedicated to federal FOIA, but we also have a section for state and local entities, which covers all the 50 states plus DC. And as you see, there's public records and also open meetings data. So that is the tracker. And as I said, we're updating it constantly.
Great. So would you be able to, on the tracker, point out if there's any changes to open government laws that would impact education reporters?
Yeah, definitely. So unfortunately, we are seeing several examples of public bodies making changes to their laws that would affect education reporters. So I figured a helpful way to start would be to just Control F for school. So feel free to do that if you're following along on the tracker. And the first thing that comes up is you'll see that the LA Unified School District is experiencing delays with their processing of public records requests. And we have links that accompany all this data so you can see for yourself how we got this information. And in this case, it looks like an individual reporter posted on Twitter, perhaps in response to one of our tweets asking for this sort of data from reporters. And let's see, Douglas County School District in Colorado. It looks like in Colorado, this particular school district informed a requester that the district wouldn't even respond to her records request until after the district office is reopened. So that particular reporter, who knows how long they're going to be, who knows how long their public records request is going to be delayed. And we'll see tons of other examples: Florida, Illinois, Tennessee. I know that some Chalkbeat reporters reported on a violation of the Tennessee open meetings law with respect to a Shelby County School District board meeting. So definitely feel free to use this tracker as a resource when trying to find examples of individual cases where your access to public records and open meetings might be affected.
Great, that is really helpful. I'm wondering, are there any states that you know of where reporters should be more aware of some more sweeping changes that have reduced access to open records than there was before?
Yeah, just quickly so I know where to look. Is my screen still being shared or no?
It is. It is.
Are we able to revert it back, just because I think I'm done with the tracker portion for now? Okay, perfect. Awesome. Now I know where to look. Okay, yeah. So unfortunately, so let me take a step back. So I'll note that there are several states where, even though we haven't yet obtained tangible data from school districts or from public universities, there are plenty of states where the legislatures or the governors have taken sweeping action to suspend or restrict open government laws. So I'll use Hawaii as an example, just because it's so egregious. In Hawaii, the governor just up and suspended the state's public records law. So even though, as you'll see from the tracker, we haven't yet obtained particular data from certain school districts in Hawaii, if journalists are seeking records from, say, Hawaii's public schools, they may run into obstacles in trying to access public records. I'll also note that significant changes to public records laws have also happened in New Jersey and Washington, D.C. So those are jurisdictions where journalists may want to be a little bit more vigilant.
Yeah, and I think Hawaii only has one school district, so that would actually impact all the schools in Hawaii. What about in higher education? Are there any examples that you can think of in higher education where this really has made an impact, these changes or waivers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say that when it comes to higher education, we're definitely seeing a mixed bag. For example, Portland State University in Oregon has fortunately said that they're still going to be processing public records requests as they normally would, and that they're, proactively going to be contacting individual requesters in the event that delays do come up. But on the other end of the spectrum, this is an anecdote that I just find ridiculous on so many levels. We have the University of Florida, where a school newspaper sought the university's pandemic response plans just in order to evaluate whether the university was in fact complying with its own plans. But the university was not turning over the response plans, and they were citing an exemption that was designed to prevent the release of terrorism response plans. One of the sponsors of the law that the university was citing emphatically insisted that the school really should release those records, just given the strong public interest in them. So we've definitely seen a variety of responses from institutions of higher education.
Interesting. So when these emergency waivers or executive orders are established, I imagine that many reporters might have to actually educate some agency workers. They might not be aware of the changes that have taken place. So do you happen to have an example of an executive order that maybe, or a change to a state legislation that you could kind of walk us through, and what are some key points that reporters could go and maybe say, hey, in the opposite direction, hey, this emergency waiver actually does not say that you can't release any records.
Yeah, that's a really good question. A lot of these changes have happened so quickly, and some of these emergency orders do contain nuances that public records processing staff may not necessarily be familiar with. So by all means, if you think it's going to be worthwhile to more aggressively push back against a denial that you think is suspect or unsupported or just too extreme, we would absolutely, encourage you to do that. So as an example, let's talk about New Jersey. So let's say you're seeking records from a school district in New Jersey and they say, sorry, we're not going to process this while we're dealing with the pandemic. Or maybe they don't respond to you at all. Well, that's a huge problem, because even though New Jersey's OPRA, Open Public Records Act, has been modified by the state legislature, what the statute now says is the agency has a duty to make a reasonable effort to respond to your records request within the statutory deadline. So even though it's obviously hugely problematic that the statutory deadlines have been so relaxed, there isn't even a deadline in days or weeks or months. The only obligation is you have to make a reasonable effort to comply. The agency still has to do that, though. They still have to make a reasonable effort to respond. So these are the sorts of nuances and specifics that you can use to push back against undue delays or non-responsiveness from government bodies right now.
Well, and so we just had a question roll in that I think is related to the last point you made, and it is from our very own Kim Clark at EWA. She says, so is the only solution to sue? I mean, what actually works to force these government agencies to change course and provide information?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Litigation is by no means your only recourse. In some of the more in some of the states where we're seeing more egregious decisions being made, like in Hawaii, litigation may be an option. But I will say that in some of the best practices that the Reporters Committee has listed, being compassionate and respectful and trying to be as persuasive as possible with individual records officers can go a long way. And just in my experience doing FOIA, there are tons of FOIA staff out there who really take their jobs as public servants really seriously, and they want to get the information out there. So, use all of the charisma and creativity and compassion that you've got to try to be persuasive with records officers. But I also think that pointing to examples where individual bodies are striking that balance between, observing social distancing, working from home, being safe, but also getting the information out there, pointing to those examples can help persuade the agency that you're working with to do the same. And just one example that I'll throw out there, and you can find more on the tracker, would be Vermont, where the Secretary of State of Vermont has actively encouraged agencies in that state to proactively disseminate information online to save journalists and others from having to go through the process of filing formal records requests.
Okay. And I have one last question before we turn to the Chalkbeat team, because this is something I've heard out there talking to reporters is I've heard some reports of schools and agencies being over compliant to privacy laws in particular during coronavirus. So for example, when reporters request data such as how many staff members in your school district have tested positive from coronavirus, and they're getting responses back saying that's FERPA protected. Can you clarify HIPAA and FERPA for us? Because I imagine a lot of reporters out there are trying to get some coronavirus related data. And so I'm just wondering, from your legal perspective, what can you tell us about HIPAA and FERPA that might be relevant for education reporters during the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the reason I'm chuckling right now, I'm going to do my best to clarify HIPAA and FERPA in 60 seconds or under. If you're like me, I'm a very right-brain person, so you're not alone in finding this hyper-technical area of the law very confusing. I'll start by saying that on the Reporters Committee website, you'll find two things that I think will be extremely helpful to you if you run into obstacles involving either HIPAA or FERPA. Firstly, just last week, we published new resources on our website about HIPAA and COVID-19. And it contains really helpful, I think, very easy to follow information about when HIPAA applies and when it doesn't. For example, it only applies to covered entities. Those are going to be insurance companies, hospitals, and their business associates. And it also very helpfully explains the principle that if a state's public records law requires the information to be disclosed, HIPAA cannot bar that. So definitely check that new resource out if you want to learn more about when it's appropriate for agencies to invoke HIPAA in response to your public records request. With FERPA, I'll note that we have a comprehensive 50-state open government guide on our website, which contains sections on the interaction between FERPA and state public records laws, which could be a helpful resource as well. But what I'll end with is as a general principle, FERPA, like HIPAA, does not prevent the release of de-identified aggregate data. So that can absolutely be a principle that you leverage if entities are invoking either of these two laws to withhold records.
Great. Thanks, Ganitha. So let's turn to the Chalkbeat team. And let's start with Patrick. Patrick, I know you've run into some obstacles in Newark where you've been reporting. You've been there for a few years now, since 2018. So you kind of have the before and after, well, I guess before, during Corona, and then we'll see what happens after. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges you faced during the pandemic related to access and transparency? And why don't we start at the district level?
Sure. Yes, and thank you again for having me. Just some context, Newark is New Jersey's largest school district, about a $1 billion budget. So there's a lot going on here and a lot to watch. And some of these issues around access and transparency we have dealt with before the pandemic, but I would say that this has really kind of underscored those challenges and why it's so important to get that information. And so this really started to come up leading up to when schools were closed in March, and districts across the state and across the country were preparing for how to handle the outbreak. And what I was hearing from families is that there just wasn't a lot of information being shared about what was going on in schools. There was a lot of fear at that time, if people remember, about, were students going to get infected, were teachers and things like that. And there wasn't a lot, really, any information being shared with the public. And so I think that was the first way that this came up. There was no sort of public announcements on the website or press releases or interviews or anything like that. And just, an example of this, I happened to be reporting at a high school one afternoon in early March, so before schools were closed. And I happened just to see that at the end of the school day there were stacks of letters on the pavement outside the school. And those were letters that the district had sent home to inform parents about what it was doing around coronavirus safety. And they obviously had not made it home. And I talked to families after that, and they hadn't seen those letters. And so we reported on the information that was in there, but it wasn't on the district website. It wasn't anywhere else. And so I think that just kind of shows that kind of outdated models, like just sending letters home, is not really going to cut it during a pandemic. And so I think there's really need for over communication. And then at a more, I'd say, kind of substantial level, and this, Ganitha was mentioning this about the college in Florida, but in New Jersey, districts all had to create school closure plans, kind of contingency plans, what they were going to do with remote learning, special education, meal distribution, if schools had to close. Newark created one, and then after schools closed, a lot of districts started posting them online so the public would know what they were going to be doing during this time. Well, Newark did not, or at least it was nowhere that I could find on the district website. And so I had requested an OPRA, which is, again, as we were just talking about, it's the public records law here, a form to file a request with the district. And the custodian for the district told me that they would not be responding to any OPRA requests until the district and school buildings reopened. And that hasn't changed since then. And just yesterday, the state announced that buildings will be closed through the end of the academic year, and we don't know when they'll reopen. And so the district is treating that kind of as an indefinite suspension of having to respond to those policies. Then I also requested that from the state, And again, as Khadija was mentioning, because of this change to the law, they've relaxed the timeline. So it would have been 7 days to respond. Now they are not adhered. They don't have to adhere to that. And so they have pushed that back twice. So it was March 23rd when I first asked for that plan. Now the date that they've given me after delaying it multiple times is tomorrow, May 6th. So that will be about 7 weeks after schools were closed that the state has not released this plan that was supposed to let the public know what the closure was going to look like. And so it just as kind of a coda to that story, I did tell the district, I was going to write about this lack of transparency. I noted that other districts had put out their plans, and they actually did. I noticed that it appeared suddenly on the website. So they did kind of respond to that pressure. So that's kind of a way to get around this. And then it just, I don't know if this is why maybe they were reluctant to share, but I ended up seeing that the district plan was about 8 pages describing what they're going to do. Other districts I came across, they were 100, 115, 50 some pages. So even what they did share, I think, is very limited in terms of what they're actually doing.
And so what about at the school board level? What are some challenges and obstacles that you've run into? I know you've done some reporting on this. And by the way, congratulations to you, Patrick, for being a finalist in the National Awards for Education Reporting. Wanted to mention that. Can you tell us a little bit more? You just laid out a lot of the district issues, but what about some of the things that you've reported on at the school board level?
Sure. So the school board, and this is another thing that I had seen happen in some other districts, so maybe some people on the webinar here have encountered this, but the school board, a couple weeks after schools were closed during their virtual meeting, had a resolution to suspend their policies during the pandemic, during this public health crisis, and to give some emergency authority to the superintendent. But it was pretty sweeping authority. That the exact language is that the superintendent can take any and all action necessary and appropriate to continue operating the district during this time. And technically there's some language that the board has to still kind of oversee that, but there's no real details. And in fact, this resolution, which the board approved unanimously, was never posted, never written anywhere. It was just the board president read it aloud during the meeting, and then the board approved it, and there was very minimal discussion. And so since that time, the board's policies have been waived. That was what they agreed to do. Other districts across the country where I, just Googling and happened to see that, people had written about similar things, I noticed some differences in that they, set some expectations, some strings to this kind of authority. So maybe the superintendent could continue purchasing or doing payroll, or they had to inform the board when actions were taken, but none of that was stated here. And so it really, I think in some ways could kind of be seen as a blank check. And it's not to say that, we're expecting anything kind of nefarious to happen with that authority, but I think it just opens the door and it just limits kind of accountability and the oversight of the board. So I think that was the biggest thing. And then just the final thing was that they did have that first virtual meeting, but then last month in April, the board election had moved, and so there were some changes, and they ended up canceling the board meeting. And so they didn't have a public meeting last month, kind of at the height of the pandemic here. And instead, the superintendent met with small groups of board members, which by doing that, they were not having a quorum, so they didn't have to adhere to the open meetings law. And an expert that we spoke with at the state kind of good government group said that having those kind of back-to-back small group meetings actually violates or could be interpreted to violate the law, because it's kind of circumventing that rule about meeting as a public board. And so I think I'll just kind of finish by saying that I think the upshot of these different issues of the lack of communication, the lack of board meetings and oversight by the board has left some big unanswered questions that we have reported on aspects of it that we've been able to by kind of going around the district, but it's still really important information that we don't have, and those include what is the attendance rate during remote learning, like how many students are actually logging in, what has been the impact on the budget. We're expecting that there's going to be a lot less funding from the state, that they might have had to make emergency purchases. How many students still need laptops? I've heard anecdotally from teachers that there are a lot of students that do. I've heard the district kind of privately asking funders for laptops, but they haven't said how many families still need them. How are special education services being provided? We've heard anecdotally from families that they're not. And then what's going to happen, moving forward? For example, if summer school, will kids be going into buildings or will it be virtually? I think these are all things the district is working on, and it's not to say that this isn't happening, but I think the public doesn't know, and so it's harder for us to keep track and hold the district accountable because we just don't have that information.
Yeah, absolutely. Eric, let's turn to you. What has it been like on the editor side of things? You've had more of a bird's eye view of this as a national editor for Chalkbeat. So can you give us a sense of the challenges that other Chalkbeat outlets may be experiencing on the ground?
Sure, and echoing the others, thanks very much to EWA for holding this webinar on this important subject. What Patrick described, some of the challenges that he faced reporting in Newark, that and a situation in Memphis and Shelby County schools, where we also have a bureau. Those are the two really instances that we thought raised some real questions about transparency and caused us to write a story about a month ago now that kind of delved into this issue that we've been talking about here. So what happened in Memphis, I'll just like unpack that a little bit here. One of our reporters got wind of the Memphis School Board's plans to meet privately over video conference in late March. This was the first such meeting that was happening in, the COVID era. It was a work session. It wasn't a school board meeting. There was not going to be any voting, but typically, as you guys all know on this call, work sessions are public, and in some cases we can find out quite a bit, sometimes more. Sometimes like even more robust discussions take place during work sessions than they do in school board meetings. So the school district had maintained that this was a attorney-client discussion, and in their interpretation, could be closed. So we heard about this, and actually in a part of a legal initiative that we're a part of in Tennessee that I think we're going to talk a little bit more about in detail, a attorney with the RCFP representing us wrote a letter. First tried to reach the attorney for the school district to basically try to intervene, to say, hey, we don't think that this should be closed. We think we should be able to monitor this remotely over video. Never connected. The meeting started and it ended. From our own reporting and knowledge, we felt like it should have been open, and that what was covered in that meeting strayed beyond what legally the school district could have cited to have a closed meeting. So we did have that attorney writing on behalf of Chalkbeat, did write a letter to the school district attorney challenging it and contending that we thought it should be open. The school district attorney did respond within a couple of days, and this is online. All the correspondence we posted, like a lot of news organizations do, trying to be transparent, showing our work, showing the original source material. The letters, the correspondence, the letter that we wrote, as well as the letter that the school district attorney wrote in response, are all linked to in the story that we wrote about a month ago on this topic. And the school district's response, the attorney's response, was that our inquiry, quote, could not have come at a worse time. And then made a really unique argument that I hadn't seen before. He contended that the district, for one, was not required to notify the public of the meeting. So not only was the meeting closed, but there was no public notice of the meeting. But he contended that because our reporter found out about it, that was, in effect, public notice of the meeting. Now, this is unique. I'd never heard this before, but then he went on to say, but we didn't have to do it anyway. That letter, you can read it online if you'd like to check out this attorney's response to it. But since then, to our knowledge, that school district in Memphis hasn't held any additional closed-door attorney-client meetings. They are holding Zoom meetings that they advertise ahead of time now. And our back and forth with them over that issue has not been wrapped up yet. There have been a couple other things that have come up since then. In Chattanooga, where we don't have a bureau in that city, but our folks in Tennessee are aware of the situation. There's some ugliness in a school board meeting where 3 people in an online chat sent like dozens of racist messages targeting Black council and staff members, and that chat was eventually disabled. We've seen some examples of public comment being limited, including Chicago, which we have covered and written about, where it used to be that at the start of a board meeting, there would be a huge open public comment session with like 60 parents and community members and teachers weighing in on various issues. That's been like cut back to a total of 30 minutes and only 15 speakers. So there are, we've seen this kind of play out in different ways since our original story for both better and worse.
Yeah, so you mentioned the reporters in Memphis working with lawyers that are part of the extended Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press team, and I believe it's their local legal initiative. I think that Chalkbeat ran a story about this, but could you just explain a little bit more about that partnership and how that got started with Chalkbeat and the Tennessee Bureau? And how I imagine there might be a lot of reporters tuned in who might be interested in developing a relationship with similar organizations in their local area. So how did the Memphis newsroom get involved with this partnership with RCFP?
Sure. So this was a competitive situation. This was something that we applied for, and actually not alone. We applied as a group of media organizations in Tennessee and good government organizations in Tennessee, and were selected to receive the support through the local legal initiative. Now, this is just so crucial for media organizations in normal times, right? Where I've just been very lucky throughout my career to work with excellent media lawyers. And a good media lawyer is more than an attorney. They're also like really good editors and will often ask very good questions. So having a attorney to work with, to bounce things off, to consult with is so valuable. And in this case, we are part of this group of other organizations in Tennessee that kind of pulled together to try to get the support. So we're going to be able to use help to obtain public records, hopefully gain access to hearings and meetings, and also defend against legal threats and lawsuits. And that's the thing that is really something that we probably couldn't do otherwise. We have attorneys that review our work for libel, but going that step further and having someone who can write a letter like that lawyer wrote for us in Memphis, those things make a difference, right? Those things make a difference. We can push back, and like Patrick was saying, holding up other examples of more transparent school districts and school boards can be a pressure point. But an attorney's letter is something above and beyond. So I would encourage folks in general to pool their resources, right? The more organizations that band together like we did in that application, I think the better your chances of getting that kind of support. And also, if you don't know about a good government or freedom of information organization in your state, check it out. There are many of these throughout the country. Here in Colorado, where I'm based in Denver. The Colorado Freedom of Information Coalition is a valuable resource that has one of those awesome media attorneys on staff. We're proud members of that organization.
Great. Well, speaking of resources, I want to turn to a question from our audience, and this can be open to the panelists. This is from Dahlia Bazaz at the Seattle Times. She writes, she asks, how do you recommend that reporters track purchases during the time that school boards have waived these approval policies or made other kind of suspensions of traditional transparency laws or rules? Any advice on that? Patrick, have you had any?
Yeah, I have to say this is something that I'm still struggling with here because they haven't. There wasn't that board meeting last month which would have been kind of the first after several weeks of the shutdown when they would have gone over the budget. So we are waiting on that. They actually approved the budget here at their first virtual meeting, but they hadn't made any changes to it. It was the budget they'd already prepared before the pandemic really struck. And so I think we are just trying to figure out how we can learn how spending has been affected, how payroll, how just in all the funding streams I think are going to be different too in terms of like meal reimbursement because the way this schools are doing kind of grab and go meals. And so I think there's going to be a lot of changes that I can't say at this point that we've gotten hard numbers. It's something that we're trying to figure out.
Yeah.
Just two really quick thoughts on that. One, like traditional source reporting, right? Working your sources, talking to people, like trying to shake loose information that you could use to maybe tailor a records request. And then even if the purchases themselves are not tracked in the traditional ways that you'd be able to get your hands on, there's still probably a paper trail. There's still probably communications, emails, communications between district officials and whoever contractors are, ed tech companies that you can request. And the more information you have, of course, to make those requests, the better. So you have success and don't cast such a wide net that you'll end up with like an exorbitant cost to you to fulfill the request.
Well, speaking of sourcing, that was a question that I had again to all three of you. What advice do you have for reporters who can no longer grab that elected official who steps out into the hallway or takes a call in the absence of public meetings in particular? So what advice do you have for journalists who are working from home and missing out on the kind of sideshow of audience participation and protests and public comments? Patrick, again, I'm going to turn to you. How have you kind of worked your sourcing without these public gatherings? Any advice or ideas on that?
Sure. Well, one kind of silver lining here, and I'm sure that some of the other kind of beat reporters might have found this as well. It actually, folks being home from schools, teachers, and families, it actually has made it a little bit easier to reach people during the day for reporting. I've had to get creative and using social media a lot more to get a hold of people and things like that. But I have been able to talk to a lot of folks, and through that, going around the district often is the best way to get information. So, even if they're not telling their official policy, for example, on virtual learning, I've spoken with enough parents and teachers that I really have a sense of what that looks like, and I'm able to report it on the ground and often showed some of the discrepancies between what the district says is happening and what we're actually learning is happening on the ground. So I'd say that's not too surprising, but just talking to a lot of folks. Another example, I talked to a student who passed along information that the superintendent, who hasn't given any interviews during the pandemic, hasn't made himself available, but he held a virtual town hall of students and shared some information about how many students still needed laptops. At that point, it was more than 2,000 kids still didn't have laptops several weeks into remote learning. So, the student actually became a source for that story, and we report on that. And so kind of using sourcing to get information that the district really should be providing is one way. And then just a few other kind of tips that I think, I've found have been useful. One is, as Eric and Kenita was saying, it's going to experts at the local, state, and national level. I talked about the state open government person who really was able to talk about what the board was doing, whether that adhered to laws, and raise questions about it. And then national folks, like even not just press groups, but like I talked to the National School Board Association and was able to get some perspective on whether their board, other boards were doing these kind of emergency resolutions. And they were actually pretty skeptical of the board doing this and said, they can't just transfer away their authority in this way. So I thought, getting that kind of perspective. And then again, Eric had mentioned this, but comparing your district to other districts, preferably nearby, but to give a sense of what is possible and what other folks are doing. For here, it was the example of other districts that had posted their plans, or, there's one nearby, very similar district to Newark, where the superintendent is posting video messages and every day has detailed data about how many meals were served and things like that. When we can show that in stories, I think it lets the public know what's possible and what kind of information they could be getting and aren't. And so just kind of putting that pressure on the district. And then I'd say the last thing is just, kind of explicitly reporting occasionally when the district isn't sharing this information. Again, I think other folks, I'm sure other reporters do that as well sometimes, but, for example, we wrote a story about attendance and how the district wasn't actually sharing and might not even be sure what the district-wide attendance rate is during remote learning. And I noticed that right after that, there was a virtual town hall and some advocates were asking for that data. And so I think by putting it out there, letting people know that this is important information, it can just build some pressure to release that.
Thanks, Patrick. Any other thoughts, Eric or Gunita?
Yeah, I'll just very quickly add, that was all super helpful, but I'll just note that while using public records laws can, of course, lend an air of legitimacy of sorts when you actually get the records, and then you could say, oh, I obtained this through the FOIA or through Oprah, but there's nothing stopping you, as I'm sure you all know as journalists, there's nothing stopping you from using avenues outside of public records laws, like talking directly to people in government, talking to people directly, organizing that school board meeting. At my last job, when I was filing a dozen FOIA requests a day, I developed relationships with all of those public information officers. And then it got to the point where I was just emailing them outside of my proper FOIA work and use that as a means to obtain information. So, y'all just get creative. I know I have faith in you.
Thank you.
I can just add a couple things. Yeah. So first off, like we've talked about some examples that maybe aren't the model way that you would like a public agency to behave. But I think the vast majority of school districts are like trying, right? And are responsive and are like trying to work in a lot of cases with local media. And like looking for opportunities to do that, right? We've been out, Chalkbeat reporters have been out at food distribution sites to see how these things are run. And that gives you an opportunity to have some interactions with people at a time when school buildings are closed, right? That's a chance to see like frontline workers. These are frontline workers at schools handing out this food, as well as connecting with parents that like you might not be able to get to. You might not be able to reach through like social media outreach or call outs in a newsletter or at the bottom of a story. We've used all those things too, just trying to combine those efforts to get results. But like we're really careful when we go out into the field, and we take precautions to protect both our people and our communities. But that's one thing. I think that making sure that and pressing public agencies to, even though we might not be able to be in the same room asking them questions, there are ways to recreate that virtually, right? Can reporters ask questions virtually? Can we follow up, right? Can there be like a back and forth as close to like quote normal as possible? Mm-hmm. Now that doesn't mean that we're going to get answers to questions. Like some things aren't going to change. We still might not get the answers that we'd like, but there's still those opportunities. And then finally, I know that like a lot of media organizations have banded together and written to public officials in the respective states, governors, and pressing for these kinds of things, like pressing for transparency, pressing for adherence to open records and open meetings laws. And I think that those things can make a difference, again, especially if we band together and make collective asks rather than one organization, several coming together to do that. I think that can really help. And then you see like reporters working together more in news conferences, mm-hmm. even not to just let things go, but to mm-hmm. continue on and not let people off the hook, so to speak.
So, Eric, you had mentioned in Chattanooga I don't know if it was a Zoom bombing, but that's kind of the term that's been used by reporters to describe these disruptions to public meetings, virtual online meetings where people, anonymous members of the public log on to disrupt. And we've seen that happening across the country with racist slurs, with pornographic material, or with just kind of general, disruption. So I have two questions for you. One, we had a reporter who just wanted to get a bit more of the specifics about the meeting where that happened. If there was a story coming from Chalkbeat about Chattanooga, that particular incident, or if there's one already written. And two, have any of you, and this is for the group, seen examples of school districts where they've managed to actually have public comment that isn't as vulnerable to Zoom bombing or disruption? Because that is a very difficult thing to do. If you want it to be public, but posting a public link makes you vulnerable. I'm just wondering if you all have seen any examples of some districts that have successfully incorporated public comment during the pandemic. So Eric, start with you.
You bet. So on the Chattanooga question, there was a story written in the local paper, the Chattanooga paper, so that issue has been covered. If you Google it, racial slurs mar Chattanooga first online council meeting, and this was from March 31st. So that story is out there for your review. And in terms of like school districts that have kind of figured this stuff out, we had just this last week, the Denver School Board had a meeting, and the meeting seemed to go off, I think, pretty well. And I don't know, I'm not sure exactly what the platform was, but basically there was a virtual waiting room, right? And public commenters were kind of herded into this virtual waiting room, and there was a tech guy there, and the tech person would then promote the speakers to be panelists. At least that's how it read on the screen. Then the speakers could unmute. Previously they were muted, turn on their video and talk. There was a timer on the screen, and then, of course, like I was saying earlier, some things don't change. The board president had to cut people off because they were going over. We've all been at school board meetings and seen that happen. So it's happening online as well. So the Denver School Board was able to successfully, I think, bring in public comment and avoid some of this poor behavior we've seen.
No, I'll just add that in Newark, just to give the district and the board some credit, that meeting they held in March, they used a program called WebEx to do their live meeting, and it was their first time doing it virtually, so of course there were going to be some glitches and whatnot, and they did make an effort to allow the public to comment. At that time, the way they did it was people had to sign up in advance and share their comments in advance, and then someone would read it for them. But they said that they will try in the future to enable people to kind of speak during it. But I think it was clear that there was a good faith effort by the district and the board to make this happen, and I think it's a good thing to acknowledge that this it's new for everybody, and figuring out how to make this work with all these new tech challenges is not easy, even when people are making their best effort.
I just have a couple quick examples to add. Not a school board or not a school board or school specific example, but I have this in the tracker highlighted, the city of Florissant in Missouri. This made me so happy to see, because this is it's not a huge town, but I saw them getting really creative with the power of technology. They used something called Swagit, which I hadn't heard before. I'm not even sure if I'm saying it correctly, but it was basically a 3-camera broadcast system in their city council chambers. And it allows people viewing the meeting to see the full agenda alongside the actual members of the city council, and they just had a really good mechanism in place for not just public access, but also public participation. And granted, not all state laws have public participation built into their open meetings laws. At the very least, public access is required, but not necessarily public participation. But in the tracker, we'll see that there are so many wonderful examples of municipalities using technology, not just to advance public access, but public participation as well. So I would definitely point you to those, just to piggyback on what everyone was saying about using positive, encouraging examples and using that as a form of pressure when you kind of face obstacles. And so definitely look at that Missouri example, because it's one of my favorites, and there are others in the tracker as well.
And I posted the link to the tracker in the chat, but this webinar will be recorded, so everyone can go back and watch. Gunita explained at the beginning where to find that tracker too. So I think we have time for one more question, and this question is broad, but I'm curious to hear your responses to it. And that is just, why is this issue of transparency so important right now during coronavirus? Clearly it's important all the time, but what about the pandemic and specifically for education reporters makes this issue a particularly important issue right now?
I can go.
Who would like to start? Yeah.
First, I just wanted to say I checked a couple things. One, Denver Public Schools was on Zoom, and that Chattanooga situation I cited was a city council meeting. So not an education setting, but certainly something that would be on the radar of education, at school districts who don't want that kind of thing to happen. So like right now, we know that school districts are just grappling with so much. Like Patrick has alluded to this here on this call, this epic, really historic shift to, figure out how to continue education for students who are home right now. Figuring out what school is going to look like in the fall, right? Balancing public health and the need to keep students engaged in learning, setting important budget decisions. And we all know that, because of the economic crisis that we're now in, that this is going to have a profound impact on schools. All these really important decisions that are being made by people who are public officials, people who we've elected or who are serving at the public's will. I mean, sunshine laws and open records laws and open meetings laws, they allow the public and the press to assess how districts are doing right now and hold them accountable. We're not like frontline healthcare workers or first responders, but like journalists are essential workers now. And it's important that we do this because the public and you guys know, like journalists, these aren't like special laws for us. This is for the public, but we're the ones whose job it is to do this work. Everyone else is doing their own jobs, including educating their own kids in their house right now, right? So it's really important that we do this. There's kind of a tendency, I think, to rally around school districts, perhaps, and public agencies at this time in hard times, and so there might be some pushback to some stories on transparency, but I think if we make this connection for readers and express to them the importance of why we're doing this and why it's important, that I think will resonate with people.
Yeah, great. Gunita.
Yeah, sure. I think it's absolutely clear that in times of uncertainty, in times of pervasive fear and anxiety, and just fundamentally in times of crisis, the public needs access to timely and accurate information more than ever. And the place that I keep going back to in my head is I keep personally thinking about how long it took so many states to start publicly releasing data on COVID-19 and race, particularly in places like Louisiana, where I know folks of color have been disproportionately impacted by the virus and by COVID-19. And I wonder how access and transparency would have looked if the officials responsible for withholding that information really understood that they were depriving people of information they needed to navigate this crisis effectively. So just to bring it back to the world of education, I'm not yet a parent, but I can only imagine the whirlwind of questions that parents and caregivers just have in their heads right now surrounding measures that schools need to take in this critical time. And I think about how being denied that information would only exacerbate my anxiety, and it would weaken my ability to make the best decisions possible for me and my family. So I think it's absolutely the case that we need more, not less information now more than ever.
Yeah, thank you. And Patrick, what about you?
I would just, echo what everyone has said and add to that I really do feel like the stakes are, as high as they could be right now. I mean, in some circumstances, really life or death when we're talking about when, students and employees are going to be returning to schools. And so wanting to have clear, accurate information about how those health risks are being addressed, but then also the really lasting, profound educational consequences of this disruption that I think we're only starting to realize, and the decisions that the district makes around learning technology, around special education, around how to compensate for lost learning time are going to have really lasting impacts on students. And so we know districts are working on these things, but we want to be able to share that with the public, hold them accountable, kind of assess their plans and things like that. And these are really important decisions that they're making. And so I just think the stakes are as high as they could be. I think that also there's a real risk of students falling through the cracks during this time. There's no state testing, for example, this year. As I was mentioning, attendance data is unreliable. And so I think really pushing districts to talk about how they're tracking what's happening to students during this time and how they're meeting their needs is really important, in holding them to account to make sure that students aren't falling through the cracks during this time. And then just the very final thing I'll say is that I think all these issues we're raising, it isn't just this temporary moment that this is happening. As people know across the country, schools are now closed throughout this academic year, maybe the summer, and then we're not sure about the fall. The pandemic is not going to be over anytime soon. And so I think really pushing back and trying to push for transparency and accountability during this time is really important, because we don't know how long this is going to last. And so I think we want to set a precedent of pushing for maximum transparency despite everything that's happening.
Absolutely. Well, our time is up. So I want to, before we let you all go, I want to remind everyone in the audience to take our survey that you will be getting after the webinar ends. Thank you again so much to our panelists, Eric, Gunita, and Patrick, for sharing all of your experience and knowledge. Again, the webinar will be up on our website within the next couple of days, so you can go back and rewatch. And yeah, thank you again for taking the time during this very, very busy time for reporters. We appreciate you all being here.